Chapter 11. There was darkness, not with the cold that she had once associated with the black hours, not with a sense of night or time. It was a stifling darkness that echoed with soft, wet sounds of rhythmic movement, the insistent pulse of body against body, but far from any act of love. It was the black of a huge machine, steadily devouring light, continually working, thrumming, eating, building toward the inevitable scream. The darkness was the dragon, calling her name, calling its prey, and there was no escape. Machiko? Light blared, loud and unwanted. Naguchi started, sat up. She rubbed her eyes. What? Hiroki stood in her doorway, his hand on the control panel. The darkness machine, insatiable. She shook her head. I had a dream. Hiroki, what time is it? Almost noon. Hiroki smiled apologetically. I know you were up late last night. Sorry to disturb you. What is it? Naguchi felt the last of the dream slip away as her eyes adjusted to the brightness. She was suddenly aware that she wore only an undershirt, and a tight one at that. Doc Revner still hasn't returned, and Mrs. Doc is starting to worry. I've sent out a crew in the copter to search for him, but I thought it would be best if the staff saw that you were in on this too. Naguchi nodded. Thank you, Hiroki. You're right. Give me 2 minutes to get dressed. Hiroki averted his eyes politely as she walked to the fresher to splash water on her face. Revner wasn't back. He'd been gone 15 or 16 hours at least. Too long. She dressed quickly and rinsed her mouth with water. In spite of the cool liquid, she felt hot, her eyes sticky and full of sand. Not enough sleep. Naguchi combed her hair with her fingers and stepped out to meet Hiroki. She glanced longingly at her bed. A nap later, perhaps. Doc had probably just had some engine trouble. He would know to stay put and wait for help. Hell, the copter was most likely on its way back with Revner already. Nothing to worry about. Except for the darkness. She shuddered as they reached the door to the building. Her dream. You okay? Naguchi smiled and gave up on the half-remembered image. Fine. I dreamed it was hot. Hiroki laughed. Pure fantasy. Naguchi smiled again, but felt the shudder deep inside. She hoped that the dark feelings were just that, fantasy. She donned her sunglasses and followed Hiroki into the blazing day. David Spanner had one fuck of a nasty headache. The pressers on the goddamn copter were incredibly noisy, no more than that. They were deadly, that was it. He'd been sent out because of all his sins to die by slow torture. Loud torture. How about after this, we can go to the cafe and get some sushi, Spanner? Nice and fresh. Maybe the abalone, all squishy and raw, or the octopus. Fuck you very much, Ikeda. Great. Only big party of the year. Everyone in town is sleeping it off, and he gets sent to pick up the doc, with the only person in town who wasn't suffering a severe hangover. His co-pilot grinned, her smile relaxed and easy. Or we can have a few cold ones. What do you say? Couple of big frosty quarts of beer to wash down the snake roll. Spanner scowled. I could just throw up on you now, save you the trouble of making me. No time, she said. We're almost there. Ikeda pulled up on the stick as they rounded a cliff and flew into the gorge. Spanner's stomach protested at the sudden dip. He wrapped his arms around his chest and closed his eyes, taking deep breaths. You did that on purpose, Ikeda. Maybe. Help me look, Lush. Spanner shook his head, eyes still closed. You look. I'm just here for the fresh air. They flew without talking for a few minutes, but it was far from silent. The pressers. It was the goddamn age of science, and no one, had invented a decent muffler. What were the techs thinking? Spanner considered jumping. At least it would be quiet. What the fuck? Spanner sat up quickly. They had just come over a low cliff, and on the floor of the gorge, there had been an explosion. A big one. Huge metallic arches like the ribcage of a giant stretched up from the still smouldering wreckage. The charred ground around the arches was strewn with large chunks of blackened debris. Of what, Spanner couldn't tell. His hangover was forgotten. As Ikeda started to set down at the edge of the site, he wished he had thought to bring a weapon more powerful than a rinse stick. It's a ship, isn't it? Spanner scanned the gorge side to side. Lots of places to hide. Yeah, I think so. Ikeda's eyes were wide. Was a ship, but not any human design I recognize. She shut off the pressers. The sudden silence wasn't so welcome anymore. Spanner gripped his rinse stick tightly. They got out of the copter carefully and walked towards the burnt-out shell. It was very quiet. Spanner's fear dissolved into awe as they neared the towering arcs. It was incredible, Ikeda said softly. Spanner nodded. And from the smell of it, the fire had been recent, like yesterday maybe. This thing. You ever heard of anything like this? Spanner looked at her. Ikeda kicked at a chunk of the odd substance. Never. She turned and started to poke through the rubble. Think of what this means, Ikeda. We're talking intelligent life here, not just some new strain of amoeba. This could be the first real proof, you know? His brain kicked into overdrive. Fucking wow. Think of the new information. If we could figure out who made this ship, could figure out some way to test this material. He trailed off, mind alive with the possibilities. Why don't you just ask him? Spanner twisted around to see Ikeda crouched down by a fallen figure. He stepped closer. Doc? And stopped short. It wasn't human. Some sort of armoured animal, but humanoid form. Except this thing was big. Spanner himself stood a little under 2 meters, and he was probably the largest man in Prosperity Wells. This guy had half a meter on him. Easy. Jesus fucking Buddha. Careful, Ikeda. I think it's dead, she said, and then watched the figure for a second. Spanner joined her. No, it's breathing, said Spanner. What the fuck? Ikeda shaded her eyes and looked up at him. You tell me, she said quietly. Her words sounded flat in the hot, dry air. The initial anxiety he had felt surged back. They were an open target down here, and maybe this guy's friends were nearby. He looked at the steep walls of rock on either side of them, and suddenly felt claustrophobic. Let's get out of here. What say? Ikeda nodded, dropped her gaze back to the creature. Yeah, but help me get him into the copter first. We'll have to come back to look for Revner later. They loaded the thing into the copter as quickly as possible, considering he weighed about a ton. They did their best to strap him to the stretcher with the human-sized bonds. It was a tight fit. When they finally lifted, Spanner felt relieved. No way was he coming back later, unless everybody in town came with him. On the trip home, he kept his eyes open and aimed at their passenger. His headache had crept back, and it pulsed sharply at his temples as the suns beat down hard in piercing shafts of brightness. Dr. Miriam Revner was an attractive woman, even when she was worried. Which she was. In spite of her calm composure, the lines of her brow and the concern in her smile gave her away. Naguchi felt an instant sympathy for the woman. Her attempt to maintain cool and continue functioning in spite of her emotions was a state Naguchi was quite familiar with. Is there anything you can think of that might help us locate your spouse? Hiroki said. Revna walked over to an examination table and motioned for them to join her. "He went to Iowa Gorge to find more of these," she said, and lifted a plastic sheet to expose some kind of spider. Hiroki frowned and stepped closer. "They're unclassifiable," the doctor continued. "Their structure bears characteristics of both carbon-based and silicon-based life forms." Naguchi nodded. "Yes, I read the report. But what made him decide to look all the way up in Iowa Gorge?" Revna smiled weakly. "That's where she said she found them." "She?" Naguchi and Hiroki spoke almost in unison. The doctor nodded. "Jamie Roth, the young woman who works for Ackland." "Thank you for your time," Naguchi said. "We will contact you as soon as we know anything, Dr. Revna." She smiled warmly and touched the older woman's hand. "I'm sure everything will be fine." They walked into the searing heat together and started towards the garage. "What would Roth be doing at Iowa Gorge?" Hiroki said. "Ackland doesn't have any herds within 20 clicks of there." "Those things weren't found in Iowa Gorge, Hiroki." "Of course. It was obvious once you thought about it." "What?" Hiroki stopped to look at her. "Think about it. If you were Ackland and you found some new life form the night before the roundup, would you risk having 3 years' profit tied up in quarantine? No. You'd say the creature was discovered far from where your herd was pastured." "But why would he report it at all? The things we saw might not be any threat to Rinth. I mean, if they were like ticks or something, they'd be easy to spot." Naguchi felt a spark of anger deep in her gut. To cover his ass. Say his Rinth do come down with some disease. Maybe the crab things are carriers. They bite an animal and infect it. He's done his duty, right? He reported it, even though they were found a long way from his animals. Hiroki nodded thoughtfully. "So, do we talk to Ackland first, or Roth?" "Roth. She'd be more likely to admit something than this Ackland. Besides, if we go to Ackland first, he might bribe her to stay quiet before we can get to her." Hiroki smiled appreciatively. "Good thinking, Machiko." Naguchi barely heard him. "If anything has happened to Kazar Revna, Ackland will be sorry," she said softly. "He sent the doc to chase dust up there. He could have had an accident, hurt himself, and that's a long way from help." After the Uman craft left, Tashinde and the others moved back to the smashed and burned wreckage to see what they had done. Meiklide had wanted to kill them, but Tashinde had held them back. He had a better idea. Tashinde was gone. He'd been dead already, of course, but the humans were Holije Bipe, crazy. In a way, it was fitting. The humans had taken the old leader, had left him to be the new one. He was a warrior now. A Seigan had been his first kill, and so he would lead them to their first hunt. Later, he would blood himself, design his own mark, and etch it in place with the hard meat thwei, and he would also mark the other students as his own. The human craft had surely gone in the direction of their dwellings, and if not, it did not matter. They would go and find the ugly small ones wherever they might be. It was only a matter of how long it would take, and that was not a concern. They had nothing, if not plenty of time.